see so many familiar and new faces here today. Yes, Joy Fingers. Let me go ahead and share my screen. 1 second. So the foundation of today's talk is going to be guerrilla theory. And this is a framework I've been working with for the past couple of years, but have recently articulated. And the whole concept behind guerrilla theory is embracing theory that is fugitive of academia. So much of academia has a heavy burden of proof, and guerrilla theory affirms conversation as the highest mode of theory and lived experience rather than the burden of proof that a lot of academic spaces hold to their core. So to start off, I want to show y'all a bit of a timeline of my digital research and theorizing. I began researching things in the digital realm in 2016 with a project called #digitaldiaspora that traveled to different places around Africa and the diaspora and mapped how young creatives were articulating new identities online. And that project evolved into Afro-Presentism, which is a term I coined alongside a Ghanaian curator, Nanase Kwadwo, in 2017, which I defined at the time as a genre fusing archival, documentary, and fine arts on and through new media in the articulation of an Afrofuturist lived reality. My conceptualization of Afro-Presentism has evolved a lot since, and we'll get into that later on in the presentation. But 2017 is really what brought this concept into being. So in 2018, I started a hashtag campaign called #divest from Instagram, which is a campaign to encourage Black queer content creators to divest their work from IG in response to a surveillance capitalist environment. So essentially, I went from thinking that Instagram was this wonderful, cool, healing, connected platform to feeling more deeply critical of it as the platform changed under Facebook's ownership. And then in 2019, after attending a talk by Olivia M. Ross, who I'll quote later on in this presentation, some of my techno-pessimism was transformed into data healing, which is a matrix of relationships and emotive aspirations that seeks to illuminate the intersections between technology, nature, and spirituality. So going back to Afro-Presentism, this is a slide from a presentation that I gave at the 2018 Instagram conference at Middlesex University that was exploring, it was entitled rather, Time Traveling Desire and Reservoir Knowledge in the Digital Diaspora, the Healing Aesthetics of Afro-Presentism on Instagram. So this is really looking at how these creatives in the different places that the Digital Diaspora Project went to were mobilizing their social media platforms and really articulating a new genre as a result. So this is another screenshot of that. And at the time, I was thinking a lot about how Instagram was fusing a lot of different genres. So we see a lot of the Afrofuturist aspirations of connectivity and like Black futurism being embodied through new media. A lot of this research was pulling from, or rather born from, an engagement with Kodwo Ishunsworth. So he wrote in 2005, imagine a team of African archaeologists from the future, some silicon, some carbon, some wet, some dry, excavating a site, a museum from their past, a museum whose ruined documents and leaking discs are identifiable as belonging to our present, the early 21st century. Sifting patiently through the rubble, our archaeologists from the United States of Africa would be struck by how much Afro-diasporic subjectivity in the 20th century constituted itself through the cultural project of recovery. In their age of total recall, memory is never lost, only the art of forgetting. Imagine them reconstructing the conceptual framework of our cultural moment from those fragments. What are the parameters of that moment, the edge of that framework? And this passage really stuck out to me because I was thinking like, wow, we really are living in this age of total recall. And looking at how different creatives were engaging with that and responding to that in their art, I realized that there is this archaeology that's happening in the digital terrain, not as a futurist aspiration, but as an embodied lived reality. So I was looking at different posts from creators. This is from a platform called The Crawl, and thinking about how people are really conjuring their ancestry online. I think between 2016 and 2018, there was a renaissance of people who were using these social media platforms to excavate things from the past, bring them into the present, and archive them from the future. Since then, though, my conceptualization of Afro-Presentism has evolved. So it began as thinking about this hybrid fusion genre, and it's evolved into something that I would call more encrypted. This is an excerpt from an interview I did with The Crawl, the platform featured on the last page. It says, Afro-Presentism is you channeling your ancestry through every technology at your disposal. Meditation, conversation, love, the web, and turning absolutely everything into a portal that takes you precisely where you need to be in this moment toward the next, until finally, the space between the dream and the memory collapses into being your reality now. So going back to some of this archival work that people are doing on social media, I was looking at two main platforms. So that's Sunu Journal and The Crawl. And these are platforms that are dedicated to archiving different components of Black culture, pulling from the archives, featuring current artists, and also just featuring documentary work. And I think that the work that this does, I think it's more than a genre, actually. These are people who are synthesizing new expressions of their identity and bringing forth new visions of Blackness in this digital chronopolitical terrain. And to me, I think of this as archaeology, as cultural archaeology. To summarize, Afro-presentist aesthetics on Instagram capitalize on self-publishing to challenge the erasure and misrepresentation of Afro-diasporic cultures. A big component of the digital diaspora research was realizing that Google is not a reliable source for this cultural archaeological work. It's very much so informed by the hegemonic structures of white supremacy, capitalism, etc. And so social media becomes this arena where Black people and diasporic people are able to write their own narratives and articulate new identities. As well as you see in the last pages with Sunu Journal and The Crawl, they're really kind of alchemizing this technology of Instagram to navigate the age of total recall and create archives for the future. However, I think another key component to the evolution of Afro-presentism from being a genre to something more encrypted is seeing the ways that Black aesthetics are co-opted underneath the regime of surveillance capitalism. So around 2018, I began being significantly more critical of platforms like Instagram, specifically thinking about how corporations would leech off of the work of Black creatives in this space and seek to monetize them through advertising campaigns, through the theft of language and posturing, a wide range of surveilling interactions. So from there, so from digital diaspora and Afro-presentism came Divest from Instagram. This was an aspirational exodus that I started embarking on when I realized that the algorithm would de-promote posts that had more revolutionary themes. So these platforms are geared to really pull out the vanity from within us. And so when people do begin utilizing these platforms for more than just archiving their culture or their looks, the algorithm is not in favor of that. So with Radical Love Consciousness, we began doing these Reflect to Revolutionize workshops in which we were really dreaming what more liberatory social platforms could look like. And we'll get to that a bit later in the guerrilla theory / Q&A component in the second half. But I was thinking a lot about what it would look like if all Black queer content creators left Instagram. And I think especially, since Facebook has acquired Instagram, the usership of that platform has skyrocketed. And so it feels really foreign to even think about abandoning such a platform. But as we dig deeper into the ways that these platforms excavate and mine culture from Black communities and queer communities and the intersection of those two, this aspirational exodus becomes more urgent. In 2019, I started dreaming up what data demands could look like. So yes, we are all on these platforms. What does it look like to be on these platforms and make demands that these platforms compensate us for our labor, give us access to our own data, and really inform us of the ways that we're using it and being used by it. Because I remember I looked up, there's an option in Instagram to download your own data. And so I did that, but what you're given is there's glaring holes in it. It's a very surface level data profile of your engagement, the posts you've shared, the messages you've exchanged, and it's only a small fraction of the actual data that these platforms really mine from us. Around this time, I was also exposed to data for Black Lives. And the founder of that platform gave a keynote address in January of 2019 called Abolish Big Data. And I was deeply moved by this concept, right, of moving the work of abolition into the digital realm and really standing up as a digital proletariat to reclaim our own information and to kind of move the needle on what Yeshi calls an ideological regime. Enter 2019. So as I mentioned, I attended a class taught by Olivia Ross, and it was entitled Neo-Cyberfeminisms. And in this workshop, Olivia said, data trauma is a real thing. That was a really landmark moment for me because I'd never thought about articulating the experiences and frustrations that I had with social media as trauma. And so I started to think, if we have data trauma, we must also have data healing. If we're living in a predatory surveillance capitalist environment on social media, what does it look like to also pursue our own healing in relationship to these devices and these platforms? So data healing emerged as a matrix of relationships, connections, and aspirations that are really thinking about re-indigenizing our relationships to these platforms. This is just a screenshot from one of our pages. At the top right here, you'll see a climate correction browser that was coded by a member of Radical Love Consciousness, Layla, and it takes some of the language, like instead of saying environment, you'd name it the living planet. Instead of saying natural resources, we say the Earth's fabric. So that add-on really, I think, in having this guerrilla theory of data healing, it's been a project of finding these little these add-ons that create paradigm shifts in our thinking and our relationship. Around that time, re-indigenization, which we'll talk about more in the Q&A. Around that time, I started digging deeper into how nature provides a fabric for the internet. I think a lot of the time we think that technology is an exclusively Western concept, and we forget the ways in which nature has been the blueprint for all of these. So this is an article from BBC Earth that speaks about the internet of fungus that lies beneath the surface of the earth. And it got me into thinking like, wow, what does it look like to reclaim indigenous connections to the land and connections to one another as technologies that we can wield and mobilize to have this project of data healing happen in our own lives. Another project or article I came across was by Matteo Pasquinelli, who wrote this article on 3,000 years of algorithmic rituals, the emergence of AI from the computation of space. And in this article, he speaks about how algorithms are not confined to mathematics. The Chinese, for example, use the word shu, meaning rule, process, or stratagem, both for mathematics and martial arts. In the end, the term algorithm has come to mean any process of systemic calculation that is a process that could be carried out automatically. Today, principally because of the influence of computing, the idea of finiteness has entered into the meaning of algorithm as an essential element, distinguishing it from vaguer notions such as process, method, or technique. And I think while it's necessary to kind of re-envision the way we use and think about the word algorithms, because indigenous societies, as you see in this passage, have been using algorithms in spirituality, in civic planning, in a wide range of arenas. You see algorithms come up, and the more we're able to broaden our scope of what we think algorithms refer to, the more we can dig into indigenous wisdom and realize its presence. So pulling from re-indigenization, something I was thinking about is like, how can I heal my relationship to social media, not just as being this platform where you like self-flagellate, but that you create a platform that you create a deep archive on that can really hold your memories and serve as a modicum of your own growth. So I pose this question to myself, and I'll ask it to you as well. If your great great grandmother had an Instagram, what would you want to get to know about her through it? And I said, I'd want to see who and what she loved. I'd want to see her face, her words, how they changed over time, the details of daily life that brought her joy, the way she evolved and the things that were difficult for her to process. I ask myself this question here because I find myself constantly needing to recontextualize what I do online, to remember that what I share is a techno fossil, of which fragments will make it into the hands and air drives of generations to come. To me, Presentism, the subgenre born from Afro-Presentism, which encompasses all people from all diasporas, is this process of recontextualization. So if I had to summarize, the intersection between Afro-Presentism and data healing, and even divest from Instagram, it is these subtle recontextualizations and thinking about presentism being more than a genre, but really a verb, a mode of interacting in the world, and thinking about presentism being coding itself. And I think that presentism really is an invitation to reclaim our quotidian lived experience, the daily moments, the small moments that we share in connectivity with others, as a technology, as an algorithm, as something that transcends the surveillance capitalist environment that we're in. Yes. I'm seeing the chat now. But yeah, so that is kind of the summary of the evolution from digital diaspora to Afro-Presentism. I'm excited to talk with y'all a bit more. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Neema. Yeah, so I just want to open up the floor to allow people to use the chat or to raise your hand to ask Neema some questions about some of the topics that she just shared with us. You can raise your hand by clicking participants at the bottom of the window. And when you click on participants, it should pop up like a panel on the right side. And at the bottom, you should have the option to raise your hand.
I also want to repose that question, yes, to whoever said presentist ways of being were being widely practiced by our ancestors. That's definitely it, right? So before we had phones and computers and all of these devices, presentism was the modicum. It's like presentism is going out to farm. Presentism is making life more possible for yourself and the people who will follow you. Oh, looks like we have one hand raised.
Okay.
Hello. Hi. Hello, Neema. Big fan of your work. I wanted to ask, I was thinking about what you were saying about looking at your grandmother's Instagram and like looking at us as these techno fossils. And I'm wondering, have you thought about, or are you participating in some kind of material archiving of your digital presence? And I'm wondering, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, something I've thought about is printing out posts. I have this pipe dream of publishing a book that's just screenshot, because I think some of it is kind of just flipping things on its head and being what we do and share is work, and is this photo book, and how can we materialize these things that could be taken away from us at any moment? Because something that I'm conscious of is that if Instagram just collapses or it becomes obsolete, what will happen to our archives then? And so yeah, that's the pipe dream. But I also, prior to all of this digital diaspora stuff, was doing a lot of work in archiving my own family's photographic archives, and thinking that question came up after I found a picture of my great grandma, and I was like, oh, this is actually kind of wild. I guess I'm someone's great great grandma. But yeah, I think the material has to go hand in hand with this digital because of the ephemerality of our digital landscape.
We have another question in the chat from Cousin D. Cousin D says, could you also hook us up with the post remedial language? And thank you for your presentation and work as well.
Yeah, yes, I will share that add-on with y'all. I'll see if there's a way to like email everyone, or maybe I'll take a moment and find the link and send it in the chat. But that the climate correction plugin like changed the game for me. It made me think of how just small interventions like that can completely transform like the digital space and how we navigate it. Because language is also like programming, right? We talk about programming languages, but like the English language itself is the coded system of a colonial empire that has just become like standardized globally. But it has a lot of bias embedded within it.
We have a question from Livia. Livia says, thank you. This is so wonderful and brilliant. I would love to know your thoughts about decolonizing archives.
Yeah, I have a bit of a tenuous relationship with the word decolonize. I think it's become mobilized really like very widely. But it's like, how do you decolonize something when the whole system, like what happens after decolonization? You decolonize and then what are you left with? I think that's why re-indigenization is such a core part of my thinking and practice, is because, you know, the archive itself, as we've come to see it, is a colonial method. Like, for example, when I go to the National Archives in Kenya, our whole archives is like from British colonial administration and their categorization and documentation of our cultures and their own rule, etc. So I think in terms of I would frame it as re-indigenizing the archive. And I think my thinking around that is that the body is the ultimate archive. And so finding ways to engage and like perform search functions within the body, think about how the body stores certain memory, thinking also about like nature as being an archive, like how do we create archives just by like interfacing with the soil and the water, and like thinking the archive is not just like paper, or it's yeah, a different structure altogether.
So I would like to add a question while we're letting people gather their thoughts. Can you describe what your visions are for a liberated digital landscape? And what does that look like? What does that feel like?
Wow. Yeah, that's a question I'd also love to post to the group. So if anyone has answers of their own, I'd love to hear those. For me, there's one platform that exists that I'd like to shout out, Arena. It's a thought bookmarking platform that has no likes and no advertising or like predatory algorithms. And I love that because it's just like putting building blocks of any kind. You can put PDFs, links, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a data healing arena channel. If any of y'all are already on it, you should definitely, you know, slide in there. But to me, a liberatory platform, first of all, my data wouldn't be sold. I would be able to, I'd be able to like see what's really happening around the world, like some sort of like kind of like Twitter. I actually had an app idea. If any coders in here, honestly, if someone wanted to even snip this one, go for it, because I don't have the bandwidth right now. But envisioning like a mapped platform where you can like travel around the globe and like click a specific place, and then like what's actually happening there will pop up, and you have like opportunities to connect with people. And it would be a space where people could come together to create new things.
I love that. I'm just like envisioning that in my mind right now.
Yeah. And it wouldn't be overstimulating. Yeah. Because I feel like a big part of our environment now is just like this limitlessness of content that is so taxing on the mind. Yeah.
Cousin D has another question. Could you talk about how we might approach forming new practices, collectives, as Indigenous people? My ancestors were enslaved in the diaspora. Through the colonial pedagogy, we are not encouraged to think of ourselves as Indigenous, let alone as an autonomous collective of people.
Wow. First of all, bars. I think a lot about how Blackness and Africanness is like peeled away from indigeneity, and I think about how a lot of that is very intentional. Like specifically in America, indigeneity, it's like the opposite. There's like the concept of blood quantum, applies to indigeneity, where you have to have, you know, XYZ to be classified as indigenous. Whereas for Blackness, it's like the one drop rule, and then you're Black. You're all Black and nothing but Black. And so I think, yeah, like Black people and African people being like, we are the original people of Earth, so that indigeneity is inherent. I'm trying to remember what the beginning. Oh, how we can like think about indigenous spaces was the first half of the question.
Could you talk about how we might approach forming new practices and collectives as
Oh,
indigenous people?
yeah. I think one, taking care of ourselves so that we survive, like doing what we need to feel good. That's a big part of presentism, is like, what are the actions and practices that can most sustain like our abundant living? And yeah, just fostering like trans interdiasporic indigenous solidarity. And like, I think there's a big pipe dream, a collective pipe dream right now, is like having communes and living off the land. And I think that's a big part of re-indigenizing too, is like forming forming pods of people who are like tending to land in a specific place, and like having that be the way that we commune with each other.
We have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm getting a little bit lost, which is a good thing, is a good thing. Well, we have some responses to the question earlier about liberated digital landscape, so I can share that. My visions for a liberated digital landscape is not only those who want to be online have the access and ability to be online safely, but it also involves a lot of communal building and creating. So speaking to like what you just mentioned.
Someone said networks that we control and own, and not having our information in the hands of huge places. Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is also just not knowing how much of our information exists. There's like this very intentional like obscurity between us and our data bodies, but they're out there. And another thing that Olivia speaks about, and Tabitha Rezaire speaks about, and a lot of technologists are speaking about in general, is that it does, like, our data is not in the cloud. It's very much so on Earth, like in data farms and like and underground in these like fiber optic cables. Yeah.
Our plan is to find and categorize the people creating culture and history in our present time. And there's access to a platform where we exchange experiences. Hearing you say that makes me very proud of this project. From Julia.
Hi, Julia.
So I want to ask another question. I was wondering if you could speak more about divesting from the internet. Hashtag divest from Instagram.
Yeah.
You could explain to us this process and what it's like and how it relates to data healing.
Yeah, honestly, Divest from Instagram was a campaign I started thinking a lot about digital health. Like, it was the product of having one too many manic episodes about the internet and spiraling about surveillance and like ads being too precise. And it was like, okay, first of all, I'm doing a lot of free work on here. I'm still broke. Instagram's making all of this money. The more work I put in, the more valuable the platform is, the data is. And so I was like, what does it look like to take like similar to a labor strike, being like, we will no longer work for you because this is not working for us. And I still think that's something that needs to happen. I think it'll take a big collective consensus and push to do that, because the unfortunate fact is, like, unless you're very well resourced, otherwise it can be difficult to leave these social platforms, which for people who are in gig markets or doing freelance work, like your opportunities are tied to that space, your networks are tied to that space. And at the time it worked out for me because I was doing a lot of connective work offline, But then when I went back to doing freelancing, I was like, oh, this I don't have the privileges in this moment to like stick to this. It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of like canceling your Amazon subscription. It's like a lot easier said than done, but it's necessary. So I think divest from Instagram is still an exodus I have aspirations towards. I think like if a collective of people come together and like collectively make data demands and like have a plan for where to migrate after Instagram, I think it's very possible and necessary. And I think there's a big public reckoning right now with that. Like, I know the Social Dilemma documentary is really big right now, and a lot of people watch that and kind of spiral. And I'm like, are like, oh my goodness, what are we doing? Like, I need to get off. Everyone's deleting their apps and stuff. But it's an abusive relationship and it's an addictive relationship. So you leave, you come back. You leave, you come back. And so unless we have something to move towards and like are really able to embody presentism, it's a challenge. But yeah.
Yeah, I relate to so much of what you just said. Because being on social media just gives you like that anxiety and you want to get away from it. And as soon as you get away from it, you want to go back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's very addictive. And like it makes me think that like some type of movement to divest from Instagram or just like social media in general. And like you said, thinking about like what do we do after that? So like maybe it's like doing the like collective work of okay, if we're going to leave Instagram, then like we need to like come together to build something that is more communal that benefits, you know, us as freelancers
Yeah.
instead of extractive.
Yeah, I think the T is because like I was saying earlier, I had an app idea and I was really gonna like go forward with this app idea, but then I realized what good is an app if the hardware is itself is also like programmed into this kind of colonial matrix. And I feel like that's where re-indigenization like enters the chat again and is like we have to change our tastes. That's something that Mandy Harris Williams speaks about a lot. And we have to like kind of heal these patterns of addiction and allow ourselves to be stimulated by like small nourishing things like your plant growing or like you know a moment that you have with a friend. Yeah, there's someone else's work that I've learned a lot from and like tried to include in all of this, and his name is Jaron Lanier. And he was a co-founder of virtual reality, and he speaks about social media as a behavioral modification empire, which I think is super spot on and like really resonates. Like a lot of data healing is remedying that behavioral modification and like reprogramming our tastes and desires.
So what's like an entry point for data healing? If I'm starting today, day one,
Yeah.
and I want to detox, but I know that I can't just like unplug myself 100%
Mhm.
and go like, you know, cold turkey. Um, what's my step one? What do you suggest?
This is a hard one to answer. I mean, really just learning more. I think the more you know, the better you can act. Step one, go look up arena.com/data healing. Dig into the stuff that's in there. Dig into Tabitha Razer's work. She has this piece, all right.
Oh, I love, yeah, really
Title.
good work.
Yeah. She speaks about electronic colonialism. um, just finding ways to nourish yourself and input things that are outside of these apps, I think is one step. But I'm still working on what that step looks like for myself right now. I think right now data healing exists as a loose conceptual framework and like a matrix of aspirations. Just even putting those two words, data and healing, together, I think is the first step. Like really journaling. I'd pose this question to the group, like what does data healing mean to you? Like what comes up when you hear data trauma and what comes up when you hear data healing? Because a lot of it is just like guerrilla theory. Like we have to have conversations about what these two terms mean to understand how we each experience them.
Yeah, that's real. It like reminds me of an exercise that I did yesterday with a few other people, and we were speaking about like, yeah, how do we heal? How do we break and heal? And just like writing down terms that came to mind, and then finding a way to realize that. And I think that's what's so inspiring about your work is that it's practice, like, you know, like you are practicing it in real time. um I feel like there's this like notion of like, okay, if I'm a practitioner, if I'm like, you know, theorist or an artist, then like I have to develop this body of work and then present it. But you're like, no, this is how I am, who I am, real time, like we're doing this, like you come be a part of it too, like,
Yeah.
you know?
I feel like thank you so much for saying that. I feel really seen by that, because a huge part of my practice is like abandoning the concept of expertise and being like just very curious about how other people are experiencing things that I happen to be thinking about, just sharing like, oh, this is on my mind, like what are we all feeling? Um, yeah, because I think theory cannot be a stagnant body. It's really interesting doing this guerrilla theory work. I've very intentionally actually not written about Afro-Presentism. I feel like writing is very stagnant, and I've been thinking like re-indigenizing theory is like oral history. Like that is how we theorized and remembered. And so I love opportunities like this to literally just chat with people, because I don't have a big thesis to present. I'm just like, this is what's on my mind. I lived these things. I know them to be true in my experience. Like, what does your experience tell you? How can we connect the dots together? Um, but yeah, I really am actually curious. What is data healing to y'all? Like, what does that, or data trauma? But talking about trauma makes me sad. So
Right. Well, maybe we could just do like another activity, but in the chat this time. I feel like that whiteboard was like a little bit too confusing. So yeah, we can just like ask that in the chat and give people a few minutes to respond.
mm. Yes, everyone is responding. Another like kind of framework point is, what is data? Like that's a term I think that is used a lot that we don't always have a clear understanding of. Um, I I define data as the sum of everything. It is the sum of all of our stimuli, and emotions are data, like senses are data. Um, I think blowing up what data means and defines and refers to also informs thinking like, okay, what is data healing? Let's see, data healing is really navigating the ways we interact and express ourselves, the way of using info as a way to share stories and build worlds about ourselves, our communities, and really feeling full in doing so.
Neema, have you read the book Wayward Lives Into All Dimensions? Oh, wait. Another message just like came in. Beautiful experiments, intimate histories of social upheaval. I found out about it yesterday.
No, I have not. I have not read that. I will add it to my long list of things to read.
I feel you. I've read like one chapter um, of, yeah, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And yeah, like I have a long list too, and I like keep saying like I need to come back to this, because like the one chapter I did read, I felt like it takes place like, you know, a few like several decades ago, but it felt like, you know, like it was still present time. And yeah, I can't do like a proper summary right now, so we're not going to get into that. But yeah, definitely recommend it, and for you and myself.
Let's see. Data healing means returning to nature and gathering our spiritual strength, chi, and putting it into all dimensions, free from concepts, reflecting reality's universal harmony and natural forces. That part, yeah. Yeah, I think when I describe data healing, I describe it as like an endeavor to illuminate the links between technology, nature, and spirituality. And I didn't touch on spirituality as much during this talk, but I think that the spirit is a core part of this. It's like, how can we return to our shared spiritual like sense of connectivity, and like spirit being this thing that connects us in a way that we can't even fully like. It's like the supreme algorithm. Um, and yet we have like these little moments of experiencing and feeling that, and those moments of harmony are data healing, because it's like healing all the information in our bodies, in the earth, and with each other.
I love that you describe algorithms and like, and relating it to spirituality. Especially because like people have this idea that AI is going to become a god, but I'm like spirituality, you know, it's
Mhm.
pretty like an algorithm, just like you said.
Yeah, I mean, AI is trying to approximate the mysticism of like of life force, right? We think about those like robots that you see crawling around and like trying to get things to move. That's trying to recreate the spirit, and it becomes very existential, because it's like, for example, when someone passes away, you see their body and you wonder what's missing from it, you know? And it's spirit. It's that activation of like living force, that we can only, it's like an asymptotic curve. We can only approach it so close, but we can never actually reach that point.
There's so many questions. I want to make sure we get them in before we hit the 4 o'clock hour. I think I would add that data warfare into the framework. Trauma presents the possibility of metabolizing that trauma into wisdom. That it feels
Mhm.
like data is also being weaponized for control, destruction, meditation upon indigenous and working people. Surviving that warfare creates data trauma.
Absolutely. Another thing I think about a lot with data healing is that data, this concept of data being the new oil, like the oil rush. It's like this, it's like black gold, you know, intangible gold. And it's just being mined and mined and mined and mined. But at what point does it become too much? It really is a warfare. When you're being surveilled and like commodified and made to commodify yourself.
Yeah, and I think like the issue, like I was watching these documentaries on like the social media dilemma and then another one, capitalism on Netflix, and they don't address like the core root of the problem of capitalism, which is slavery. How can you try to resolve an issue and like why are you so surprised that this system is extractive and exploitive when it comes from slavery and you're ignoring that fact, so there's no way to find some resolve here, if you can't address the root of the issue.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think part of this whole AI rush, it's like we want to make things that will be subservient to us. And yet there's this looming fear that they will become more powerful than us. And I think that's a relationship tension that does really stem from slavery, is this over-reliance need for domination and subservience underlaid by like a deep fear. Um, Someone said, I think we need to destroy the AI paradigm by creating fake data in order to discredit this theologized artificial unintelligence algorithmic inference. Bars. Yeah, I
Bars.
think a lot about just like, for those of y'all who watch the social dilemma or just are familiar with like the way that Google collects our data, think about making like really just being really hectic. So this was a phase I went through actually in Divest from Instagram, is like, what does it look like to be present and to just like spam it, like data overload? Because I was reading about how there's a point at which there's so much data that the data becomes valueless, because you can't possibly like scan or deduce like any logical inferences from it. And I think that could be a predecessor or a pathway to divest from Instagram, is like having everyone just go so hard, posting the most random unconnected things, and creating this like just like data bomb.
I love that. Put that on the arena board. Let's go.
A lot to add to that. Let's see if there are any last questions.
Well, if there isn't a last question, I would like to ask, could you explain to us guerrilla theory and being a guerrilla theorist?
Yeah, guerrilla theory emerged from me having a lot of academic trauma. So when I was still in school, I was majoring in African studies and my like with an emphasis on art history, and everything that I was learning and exploring was like so colonial, and it wasn't living up to what I was seeing in my day-to-day life. I was like, this is very, very outdated. And like I was just in school learning about my own trauma over and over again, rather than like being able to dream new possibilities and like, you know, having to write a paper about the depths of your cultural expression online and prove it to someone who doesn't really like see or resonate with that creates a lot of trauma. And so I was thinking about like, okay, the written word has been used to like really confine our thoughts and like create a hierarchy of knowledge. What does it look like to just reclaim conversation? Conversations that specifically pulls from our own lived experiences as a form of theory. And I think, yeah, even as you see in this presentation, it's not like most presentations. I don't like just like, I don't know, I don't even know how to describe it. I much prefer the conversational elements. I think that it's an indigenous technology of like gaining wisdom. I know that that's how I learned about my family, my culture, speaking with my family. Speaking with my elders and speaking with my peers. Um, and so guerrilla theory is just like me trying to talk about the things I notice while being fugitive from like conventional academic spaces, which I think do recreate a lot of data trauma. Also, just abolishing like this right and wrong binary um, is a big thing. Like I feel like in guerrilla theory, there is ways to be wrong if you're being like violent and oppressive, but at large, just speaking from your own experience is a very like pure mode of engaging, and like being deeply attuned or like deeply listening to the lived experiences of others opens up a lot of possibility, I feel.
Yeah, I love that we're ending on that note, because that is like where like the whole idea for Black Beyond came from. It's trying to take like resources from institutions and then put them into the community that doesn't have access to them. Like, how can we educate ourselves outside of this system and unlearn from this system? So yeah, I'm really inspired by your work, as all of our participants are today. Um, I want to thank you for joining us and for sharing your work with us. Yeah, and I also want to give thanks to the Cloud Salon team as well. Richard Thay, Sheen, Sven Travis, the graphic designers, Richard Thay from Cloud Salon, T. Toper, Jahara Pearl, Livia Foldes, and myself from Black Beyond. Our program coordinator, Sam Morrison, and of course, support from the Design and Technology program, John Sharp and Melanie Crean. While I'm like closing out, Neema, if you want to like drop anything in the chat so that people can continue to follow your work.
Yeah,
board.
let me share the data healing. Oh, nice.
Also, for those who are still here, don't forget to join us same time next Friday. Black Beyond and Cloud Salon invites Janae, Michael, and Holloway for an artist talk on the topic of queer and femme cybernetics.
Oh, thank y'all so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us and like to share in the conversation. Yeah, I'm really grateful to Black Beyond and everyone who is like putting this together for creating a platform for this to be possible. Yeah, I really hope to connect with you all, to continue connecting with y'all. Oh, I guess let me drop my website as well. Yeah, thank you all so much.